Yes, a bit like Mina, sort of partly chairing the session, I'm also just offer a short few reflections, and partly I hope from the advantage of being the last speaker formally until tomorrow morning, and to add something that has been on my mind as we've been hearing of all sorts of things. But I wanted to add it in this spirit, which is actually the spirit of the statue outside the front of the house, which no one has actually attacked me to find out who it really is. It is actually, although it's often called Eros, like the Eros statue in Piccadilly Circus in London, the Shaftesbury Memorial Fountain is its formal title. It is actually the god, or the demon really, Anteros. And I wanted to tell you the story about Anteros as a way of introducing just a few final thoughts from me for this morning. The story goes that when Eros was born, Aphrodite, his mother, noticed that he wasn't really growing up very well. He remained rather chubby, his wings were a bit stumpy, he couldn't really fly, he just sort of bounced along the ground a bit and looked a bit babyish. And she got very worried about this, and so she went to speak to her sister Demeter, who is the wise woman god in the forest, and Demeter knows how to fix most things. And Demeter said to Aphrodite, what you need to do is have another child, and the father needs to be Ares, the god of war. So Aphrodite had another child, this time with Ares. And Demeter also said, you need to call this child Anteros. And sure enough, when Anteros and Eros were together, they both grew up. They matured, their wings grew, they could fly through the cosmos and be part of the vitality of the gods in all its complicated and splendid array. And the name suggests why, because Anteros can be translated in a few ways, but in a rather primitive way, it can be translated as back love, a sort of resistance to erotic love, a kind of tension, and that when Eros finds a focus through attention, through almost maybe what kind of contradicts it in some respects, it's able to enter a spiral that lifts up towards the gods, and so Anteros and Eros together can be demons, these go-between entities that lift us towards the divine. And the reason why it's Anteros in the centre of Piccadilly Circus is precisely because the sculptor, Alfred Gilbert, felt that a bit more Anteros was needed in that place than Eros, which seemed to be quite freely flowing on the around Soho and so on. And so I rather like that secretly Anteros is there, and who knows what it would have been like if he wasn't there. Now, I wanted to start with the story part because I love it, but also because it speaks, I think, to maybe one of the things which I offer perhaps as a thought and a help to the rich panoply now of ideas and thoughts and personal engagements, collective sense of things, emotion and so on, that we have now have been voicing and experiencing. Because there's something about how, what as William Blake put it, how without contraries, there's no progress. And I wanted to speak to something about that by introducing a contrary which I have felt kind of emerging within me as another point of, another perhaps pole to add to all the richness that has been that's in the air now. I mean, sometimes I work as a psychotherapist mostly, and sometimes I think that being a psychotherapist is a bit like being Anteros, that someone comes and, as Ivo said, they feel stuck and feel the main task is to try and move, but we try and understand something about the stuckness itself and pushing back on this erotic energy. I must be somewhere else that can get panicky and so on. And so my offering just now is to channel something of my inner conservative, even my inner centre-right personality, and also thinking about what Eva did with us yesterday, with these different parts of ourselves, to introduce that into the group. And in three ways to do that. One is to say that I'm pretty sure that for all the faults of history and the difficulties of history, history also knows things that we need to know now. Not to repeat, but to know clearly enough to be genuinely inspired by history, and so to be able to return and remake anew. So, in the spirit of quite a lot of the kind of theological, religious themes that have been around and about this morning, I'm very struck that I think the world before the modern world, and in the ancient world too, was much more clearly aligned around the task of knowing yourself, both individually and collectively. In the Christian world, this would have been put perhaps as knowing that you're in the world but not of the world, after the words of St. Paul. Socrates famously made the old Apollonian motto, know thyself, into a way of life that gave birth to the way of life, now not wholly helpfully called philosophy. And it would have been written into the landscape. You know, I've read that you were never more than half an hour away from a religious house in the medieval world, even on foot. That things like pilgrimage were part and parcel of the year, you know, partly driven by the fact that for much of the year you couldn't work on the land because of the seasons, but that pilgrimage, and sometimes making very long pilgrimages which were personally very risky to places like Santiago in Spain from this country and from France, was really part of the way of life. There would have been local springs, holy wells, local wise and saintly people, perhaps living in huts or caves. This was part of the rich and very diverse panoply of medieval and ancient life, which I find it very helpful to remember. Another way in which that diversity, I think, showed up was that it wasn't a very literate culture. People generally didn't read books and perhaps couldn't speak the language of the educated, particularly, say, Latin. It was much more oral culture. And sometimes when I think we look back in history, we forget that most of people's lives was done through this kind of oral tradition, looking at images, say, of stained glass in churches. The troupe would have come to town to perform the mystery religions that would have been partly improvised as much as played. I think there's a richness now in all that which perhaps is lost in large part, but it's quite exciting to remember. And a third factor, of course, is that this wasn't the technological reach. You know, if a politician or a king wanted to impose some kind of diktat, it was much, much harder to do. You couldn't call a lockdown within 24 hours. And so there's a sense in which there was a kind of freedom in all that, for all the complications and so on as well, holding these polarities. Another aspect of that freedom has been touched on this morning, actually, say when Elizabeth talks about how there's a kind of freedom that comes on the other side of surrender. And before the law could even tell us whether we could hug our neighbour and so on, people could make commitments that carried social weight under God. So this was, for example, how marriage was contracted. It's actually John Locke, probably in a book that's on the shelf over there, that said, no, we must stop this marriage contraction under God because it's far too free. Couples can just meet in the lich gate, and before they know what's happened, before their parents know what's happened, they've got married just because they've made a promise to God. The law needs to get involved, and so churches started reading bans of marriage and so on, and it became a much more complicated business in some ways. The point was that there was another point of reference, another authority that people felt in their bones as much as had to take notice of. And that, I think, produced a certain kind of freedom. I mean, I think I've probably said this publicly, but I think about this partly in terms of what we now call gay relationships, same-sex relationships, because I'm in a civil partnership now, and as a gay man. And in a way, that was an amazing thing that the law came round to civil partnerships and now equal marriage, which when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s was not remotely dreamt of. But in my interest in these areas, I wrote a book about friendship at one point. I discovered that there was a whole tradition, almost lost now, of same-sex commitments made right through the medieval period and of course in the ancient times as well. The ones that survive are remembered mostly as men, but there were women as well who made these commitments. They're remembered in graves. Someone did some research looking at shared graves. So there's a kind of echo of that possibility. And the reason was because people could make commitments under God that would have run parallel with other kinds of commitments. There's a kind of diversity in all that. I mean, I feel that committed diversity is something that we need now as well. I think another aspect of that freedom under God was the recognition that we can't actually save the world. And I feel increasingly that's important. I was actually, someone persuaded me very powerfully of this, who actually taught me family constellations, this therapy that has been mentioned a couple of times. And she had been very involved in the environmental movement and then burnt out, maybe in some parallel ways to what Anthea was talking about this morning. But she said it was such a relief to her to realise that she couldn't save the world, but then she could learn how to relate to the world freely. And there's something about that letting go that actually is a letting in as well, that I've been thinking a little bit about. I don't know whether these things feel controversial or not to you. Maybe they don't, maybe they do, but I wanted to mention something else, which is actually the value of hierarchy. Hierarchy can clearly oppress when it's used to fix people into ladders of being and prevent movement and set up dualisms and so on, when it becomes a way of policing people's experience of life. But originally, hierarchy was actually a way of transmitting more life into people's lives at different stages and phases, different moments in their life. So the hierarch was the person who was initiated, and the hierophant, and then the arche, they channeled the ever-present origin, the beginning of all things, that was the source and the wellspring of life. And so, for example, women actually appear in, say, Dante's account in the Divine Comedy. Look over there, because there's books down there of Divine Comedy, at different points in the hierarchy. And actually, whilst women are definitely associated with the material world, it's also three women that lead Dante into the Imperium, and in particular his contemplation of the Virgin Mary, whose womb carried the divine, enables Dante to know what it is to be enwombed in the divine as well. And so that is the Virgin as an important member of this hierarchy, lifting and channeling the divine life to him, and so becoming more than he ever knew possible as a human being. So to add another polarity around that particular word, too. I think that there's something in that about how, if we're to work with difference dynamically, as well as in terms of discerning how difference has oppressed, I wonder whether there's a clue in that spirit that would be helpful, channeling my inner conservative. And then the final element I wanted to add was how in the ancient world and in the medieval world, politics and the economy in particular actually only took up a sort of fraction of life. I've been reading recently some revisionist histories of ancient Athens, and making the point that actually, whilst we may remember ancient Athens as the birthplace of a democracy, probably amongst ancient Athenians and other city-states around and about like Sparta and so on, that they were democrats would have been almost a footnote in what you knew about Athens. And it seems that the thing that people knew most about the Athenians more than anything else was they regarded themselves as the chthonic people. They were the people that knew they were born from the land on which they lived. And this is interesting because it helps to bring into focus a sense that, well, the reality that I think that it's been estimated in the way that the rational mind likes to do. About 40% of what we might call economic activity, civic activity in ancient Athens was actually around this sense of being connected to the gods of the land in which they lived. So this was around rituals, this was around buildings, this was around civic festivals, this was around the everyday libations and sacrifices and offerings which would have been performed mostly in the home, which is also interesting because the home was a place where men and women had their roles together. And so partly the reason why this is a revisionist history is to try and get us to think again about what life might have been like in ancient Athens, when 40% of life's activity was about, you might say, relating not to the ecologies of the human activities, which we now call the economy and so on, but about spiritual ecologies, which speaks to me about how we might start to learn to relate and put serious amounts of our time and activity together, as well as individually, into relating to the intelligences that are around and about us as we rediscover them, part through the work of ecology, part through the work of the imagination, maybe part through the work of spiritual movements and revivals and so on, too, putting a positive spin on a complex picture, looking at that sense of things as well. I also wanted to talk about how they're related to death, because I feel there's something really key here. The title of my talk is called Thriving in a Tragic World. And I think that they could thrive in a tragic world because they knew it was a tragic world. And it makes me think that part of the problem that we've got ourselves into is a kind of fantasy that we might live in a utopia that's not tragic, where there's a dream of progress that of course isn't delivered today because it's always written as a promissory note for the future. But in principle, we can live in a world where tragedy becomes more and more marginal, and life sails into a kind of beautiful heaven being a place on earth, a kind of material utopia where needs and so on are met. And I think this is a recipe for disaster, and maybe it's one way of understanding rampant consumerism and so on that gets out of control, because the material world can't deliver that promise. Another thought of William Blake was that more, he said, is the cry of the foolish soul. Nothing less than all can satisfy us. And what he was saying was that the all is not just the material world, which when we ask the material world to deliver to us just leads to more and more cries for more. No, we must raise our vision to embrace the all. But that's done through a process of dying. This is what Blake called the wars of love, self-annihilation. And certainly in the Christian tradition is say why the cross, the day on which the cross was born, is called Good Friday, not Bad Friday, say, or not Blip Friday that we get over before we rush to Easter Sunday. That there's something really crucial about embracing death itself and knowing that it's a pathway to life. Now, this can be talked about in allegorical ways, metaphorical ways, and so on, but I increasingly try to embrace it as actually saying that my death will be the way into more life. And it's very complicated and very difficult. It came directly into our home during the last year in the pandemic because I think Nick and I, my partner and I, both had COVID at one point. It was sort of early stages and we didn't get tested and we weren't that ill, but I suspect we had it. Anyway, the way that it came to our door much more dramatically was about 6 months later, Nick had a stroke. And it's now recognised that that can be COVID related through blood clots and so on. And it was an extraordinary day because on the one hand, I was immensely grateful for the technology that meant I could call an ambulance. We happen to live just around the corner from King's College London, King's Hospital London, and an ambulance actually arrived within about 10 minutes. It was remarkable. And we knew that we were in safe hands, the best hands, because he was then rushed to the hospital. Pathways, if you have a stroke, are really good. I've worked at the Wolsey Hospital across the road, and stroke pathways, i.e. knowing what to do in that situation, are very well developed. So if you can get access to the help, it's quite a good thing to have. And sure enough, we kind of knew within 24 hours that actually it was a micro stroke, and the prognosis was really good. But also in the same moment, it confronted me with the fact that we're going to be separated one day. And as he, I don't know how to do this. As he got into the ambulance, I realised that something was going to survive whatever happened. And it was the love that we knew and so on. And I only knew that because I sort of saw death looking at me as well as Nick looking at me. So it was a very powerful moment, and it's funny that it comes back to me so powerfully now, because one of the things I've actually rather worried about is that it's so easy to slip back into, oh, thank God we survived that, and we get back into ordinary life. I wondered how I can stay with this experience of death feeling like it was walking down, well, not just down the street, which it was doing during the pandemic, but actually had entered our home and said hello to us and said, one day you really are going to come with me, and what that really means. So I think thriving in a tragic world must mean being able to embrace that in some way. But of course, it takes a lot, and it takes a lot of support and a capacity to deal with it, and it takes the difficulty of the panic of death's moments as well, and the horror of that, and just the relief that the ambulance shows up and not wanting to lose that. Blake called it fourfold vision, this capacity to live with things at different levels at different times and so on. So I'll draw to a close there with that. Thinking about how the past, I think, really has got things to teach us and to show us when we remember that our ancestors and other people lived and wrote, developed ways of life that engage with things in a very rich way that I fear is often lost in the modern world. Someone mentioned this phrase, flatland. We do live in a flatland very much of the time. It's not a nostalgic trip into the past. It is a way of being inspired to remake things for the present. But my inner conservative wants to draw on that as much as all the other things which we listen to and have are gaining from, even as we continue this process now. So thank you very much. Thank you.